Hi, year 2 students. Hope you all are keeping safe and doing well. It's good to interact with you in another pharmacology resource session, which is again an important one for you, not only from exam perspective, but also from clinical practice angle. Anticoagulants. Broadly, the anticoagulants are classified based on the route of administration into parenteral, those which are administered subcutaneously or intravenously, and oral. So anticoagulants are basically classified into two types based on the route of administration into parenteral and oral. The most commonly used parenteral anticoagulants include unfractionated heparin and low molecular weight heparin. The unfractionated heparin is usually called just as heparin. So if someone says heparin, you need to understand that it actually refers to the fresh molecule that we obtain it from natural source, which is called unfractionated heparin. I usually don't touch upon history for drugs unless it is something interesting, unless it has some worth to be kept in mind and remembered. This heparin is one such drug whose history is interesting, especially from your perspective as a second year medical student, because this drug was discovered nearly a century ago in John Hopkins Institute, US. It was by J. McLean, this gentleman, who discovered it, and while at the time of discovering heparin, he was like you. He was just a second year medical graduate student. He was working with a physiology professor, and then they together discovered this wonderful molecule which we are even using it today. His story is inspiring. So you go through this, it's freely available paper. If you Google it, you will get this full paper. You go through it, and then it will remind you to stay inspired during your studentship, to look for opportunities in all the nook and corners. So just go through and read about it. On the other hand, the discovery of warfarin, which is the oral anticoagulant, is accidental. It was around the same time, around 1920, in North American continent, they have observed that many cattle that feed on a plant, the clover hay, which was infected with a fungus, with a mold, they died due to bleeding. So scientists were perplexed, they were confused, they were not able to find out what was causing this problem. Carl Link from US was working on this spoiled sweet clover hay plant and observed that there was a substance called coumarin that was present in the plant, which increased the risk of bleeding in those cattle, and that was the reason for widespread cattle death during that time. He was making several variations in this natural anticoagulant, and finally he came with a molecule called warfarin. Actually, the first four letters in warfarin stands for Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which actually funded his research on finding out different varied products from the natural anticoagulant. So warfarin came into existence around 1954, and it was popularly used as a main ingredient in rat poisons. So it is even now many of the rodenticides which are used to kill the rodents, right? They contain warfarin as the main active ingredient. Before going into the details of how these anticoagulants show their effect, it is important to briefly understand the physiology of coagulation cascade. We have two unique pathways in the clotting system. Intrinsic, which is activated when there is a damage to the endothelium of the blood vessel that exposes the underlying collagen to the circulating clotting factors. Factor 12 is immediately activated following the exposure to collagen, and through series of other clotting factors, namely factor 11 and factor 9, it enters or it activates the common clotting factor, factor 10. The extrinsic pathway, on the other hand, is stimulated by the external trauma that activates tissue factor, which is factor 7, and that again immediately culminates into the common pathway. So both intrinsic and the extrinsic will finally result in activation of factor 10, which activates the synthesis of thrombin from its precursor prothrombin. Thrombin is factor 2, and that carries out the final step of converting fibrinogen into fibrin, and this fibrin binds the platelets together, adheres the platelets, and it also forms a meshwork, right, like this, a meshwork in which the platelets, clotting factors will segregate, and this whole bunch is what we refer to as thrombus. This is just for you to know the physiology so that you understand the mechanisms of anticoagulants very well. So if you take the important clotting factors that you need to keep in mind are the factor 10, which is common, factor 2, which is the pre-final pathway, factor 7, which is tissue factor, factor 9, which is involved in intrinsic pathway. So these are some of the common factors, especially factor 10 and 2. You repeatedly observe that these are affected by the anticoagulants, and 7 and 9 are by some oral anticoagulants. Let's move to the first category of anticoagulants, the parenteral one, the prototype, which is very commonly used in today's world, is heparin. As I was telling you before, whenever we say heparin, we are referring to actually unfractionated heparin. If you recollect physiology again, you will remember that heparin is one of the substances present in our own body. It is in fact the strongest cationic molecule that is there in our body. It is the strongest organic acid, and it is mainly present in the defender cells, basophils and mast cells. When there is a contact of these cells with a foreign microorganism, physiologically you will see that within few minutes heparin is one substance which is released from their granules. And heparin, because of its strongest acidic property, it can easily destroy the microorganism. So heparin is in fact a protective molecule in our body. But the heparin that we are using it for the patients, that we pack it in the vial and administer it as injection, is not obtained from human source. From where do we get it then? Yes, we obtain it from pig intestinal mucosa and ox lung mucosa. So these are the two sites from where we are obtaining the unfractionated heparin that we are using it in patients. Remember, mucosal regions are rich in mast cells, and mast cells are one of the source for heparin. So we fractionate it, we process it and take the pure heparin molecule and use it in patients. How does this heparin acts as anticoagulant? Very important for you. The unfractionated heparin that we obtain it from either the pig or the ox mucosa, it is sufficiently longer or comparatively longer. Its molecular weight is roughly around 15,000 Daltons. It is made up of several glycosaminoglycan residues. When you administer it to a patient, what happens is, in the circulation we have a naturally occurring anticoagulant called antithrombin, which is shortly referred to as AT3, antithrombin. thrombin 3. It is normally circulating in our blood, and this binds to factor 10 and thrombin and inactivates these two clotting factors. Now, that is physiology. Now, when you administer heparin, the heparin binds to the circulating antithrombin 3. And in heparin, there are 5 basal residues, these ones, which are necessary for efficient binding of heparin to antithrombin 3. After the complex heparin antithrombin 3 complex forms, the heparin hastens, meaning it increases the speed of activity of AT3 in inactivating factor 10 and factor 2. Normally the inactivation happens at a slow rate, but when heparin molecule binds to AT3, it says AT3 go and immediately attack both the clotting factors 10 and 2. So it speedens up, or it hastens the inactivation of factor 10 and factor 2. Now if you see these two pictures, two parts in the figure, you will observe the difference. For factor 10 inactivation, the heparin has to do nothing except for just binding to the antithrombin 3. But for inactivating thrombin, you would see here, the heparin has to bind to AT3, and in addition, the heparin has to put a scaffold like this. It has to bend like this and then push this thrombin molecule so that the thrombin is effectively neutralized by AT3. So this is important if you need to inactivate factor 2. But for factor 10, this extra effort by heparin is not needed. It has to just bind, and that binding itself will accelerate the AT3's activity of inhibiting factor 10. This is important for you to understand, right? So this happens with unfractionated heparin. We have another parenteral anticoagulant called low molecular weight heparin, which is nothing but you take unfractionated heparin and you chop it, you cut it, and you get smaller derivatives from unfractionated heparin, which are roughly around 1/3 in length compared to unfractionated heparin. So if they are on an average 15,000, the unfractionated heparin, because they are 1/3, you can see the molecular weight of low molecular weight heparin will be roughly around 4,000 daltons. And you can see the length here. It's roughly 1/3 of unfractionated. But it has to have the pentasaccharide sequence, the 5 residues that are necessary for the molecule to bind to antithrombin 3. So when low molecular weight heparin is administered, it does the same job. It binds to AT3 because it has the 5 pentasaccharide sequence. So it binds to AT3. It stimulates, it accelerates AT3's activity of inhibiting factor 10. And for factor 10, as like unfractionated heparin, there is no extra effort needed. So the LMWH can just bind to AT3 and inactivate it. But for factor 2, you need this extra effort. It has to bend and then push, isn't it? So this extra effort is needed, but LMWH is on an average 5000 Daltons. So what do you mean by average? Average means it is the middle value, right? So when we say 5000 Daltons, if I take 10 molecules of LMWH and measure their molecular weight, I would see some around 2000, some around 3000, some around 5000, some could be around 7000, some could be 10,000. But most of it, 4 molecules will be maybe at 5000, and maybe remaining one could be on the either sides of the middle value. So when I say average, I am just referring to the most commonly occurring middle value. So in a preparation of low molecular weight heparin, you would also observe some molecules which are having higher molecular weight. Very few molecules probably. And those molecules will be sufficiently longer enough to put this scaffold to inactivate thrombin. So if I have 10 molecules, 9 molecules will have length only to inactivate factor 10. Maybe I can have one molecule that is sufficiently longer to inactivate factor 2. That is why low molecular weight heparin is referred to as preferential factor 10A inhibitor. So they mainly inactivate factor 10 and less inactivation of factor 2 is noted. So this difference you need to keep in mind. Now we have a third molecule, which is nothing but just a synthetic preparation of this 5 basal residues. So the 5 basal residues can just bind to antithrombin and will inactivate factor 10, and none of the molecule will have a length to inactivate factor 2. This molecule is referred to as fondaparinux, which has only these 5 residues, and it becomes a selective factor 10A inhibitor. Doesn't do anything to 2. So this is the difference between the heparin molecules in terms of the clotting factor inhibition. Unfractionated inhibits 10 and 2A equally. Low molecular weight heparin prefers 10A. Some molecules can inactivate factor 2. Fondaparinux, which is the synthetic pentasaccharide sequence, it has only this 5 basal sequences, can inactivate only factor 10, doesn't do anything to factor 2. This is the key slide that compares the different characteristics of these 3 heparin preparations: unfractionated, low molecular weight, and the synthetic parenteral anticoagulant called fondaparinux. If you notice, we obtain the unfractionated heparin from pig intestinal mucosa or ox lung mucosa. And after getting the unfractionated, you process it and make it smaller, and that becomes low molecular weight heparin. The Fondaparin-X is artificially synthesized, which has only the 5 basal sequences, pentasaccharide sequence. Because of this difference in the length, there is a corresponding difference in the molecular weight. LMWH is 1/3 of unfractionated. Fondaparin-X is 1/3 of LMWH. As we discussed, unfractionated can inactivate both factor 10 and 2 equally. LMWH prefers factor 10. Some molecules may have sufficient length to inactivate factor 2, and Fondaparin-X, because of its shorter length, it can inactivate only factor 10. Unfractionated heparin can bind or has more binding affinity to plasma proteins. So, if you have a patient and you are giving unfractionated heparin, we don't know to what extent in that particular patient is unfractionated heparin circulating free, and what is the fraction of unfractionated heparin that is bound to plasma proteins. Hence, we cannot predict the anticoagulant effect of unfractionated heparin because it has a high affinity to plasma proteins, and so we need to monitor the unfractionated heparin's anticoagulant effect with a specific laboratory test. On the other hand, both this LMWH and Fondaparin-X, they bind to plasma protein considerably less. So if you give 10 units, hypothetically, we don't give it in single digit, right? We hypothetically, let's assume you are giving it in 10 units. Almost all the 10 units will be circulating in the plasma, and they will bind to the antithrombin 3 and will correspondingly inhibit the clotting factor synthesis. So the effect of both LMWH and Fondaparin-X is predictable, and that's why there is no need for any laboratory test to monitor the anticoagulant effect of both these parenteral preparations. This is the important point that you need to keep in mind. So we monitor only for unfractionated, and lab monitoring is not needed for both LMWH and Fondaparin-X. When you say parenteral, it means you give in any route other than oral. So usually the anticoagulants are given either subcutaneously or intravenously, either as bolus or infusion. An important point, please keep in mind, please remember till you graduate and practice that none of these parenteral anticoagulants should be administered intramuscularly. It's a crime. never ever give any parenteral intramuscularly, because muscles are richly supplied with blood vessels. The patients may bleed and it may result in life-threatening hypovolemic shock, hematoma. So a lot of catastrophic events could happen. So intramuscularly should never ever be injected, either subcutaneously or intravenous is acceptable. So if you are injecting unfractionated heparin subcutaneously, only 30% of the preparation is available for binding to antithrombin 3. We use a term called bioavailability, right? Unit 1. Try to remember the basic pharmacokinetic concepts. Bioavailability refers to the fraction of the active drug entering the systemic circulation from the site of administration. So when you are administering 100 units of heparin, only 30 units will enter into the systemic circulation and will show their therapeutic effect. So which is very low, isn't it? Only 1/3. So that is why if you are using parenteral anticoagulant for treating, right, for treating an existing thromboembolic disorder, for example in the present patient who would already have developed pulmonary embolism, so now you are using an anticoagulant to treat. So when you are using anticoagulants for treatment purpose, never ever you should choose to give unfractionated subcutaneously, because only 30% is available. That will not be sufficient enough to treat. But if you are giving unfractionated heparin as a prophylaxis, suppose, let's take the same problem where the patient underwent some surgery, like I think 5 days ago, right? So during that time, if the physician wants to use the unfractionated heparin as a prophylaxis to prevent occurrence of DVT in that patient, then you could choose giving unfractionated heparin subcutaneously. This 30% is adequate for prophylactic purpose, but definitely not for treating a patient with established thromboembolic disorder. So heparin you choose to give subcutaneously only for prophylaxis. If you are treating, you have to give it, you have to give it intravenously and not subcutaneously, right? On the other hand, if you see low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinux, even if you give subcutaneously, almost all the molecules will be able to reach systemic circulation and will produce their therapeutic effect. So doesn't matter you give IV or subcutaneously, they are going to be having a similar therapeutic effect. Another important PK pharmacokinetic difference is unfractionated heparin is short acting. Its half-life is just 1 hour. On the other hand, low molecular weight is 4 times longer, and fondaparinux is even much longer than unfractionated and LMWH. That is why, because of this very short half-life, even if you are giving unfractionated heparin IV for treating a severe thromboembolic disorder, it rapidly undergoes degradation, and so you may have to choose to give it as continuous infusion. On the other hand, LMWH and fondaparinux you can just prefer to give once a day, bolus, or subcutaneous. All these are advantages of preferring LMWH or Fondaparinux over unfractionated. But there are two disadvantages of LMWH and Fondaparinux. First is both LMWH and Fondaparinux, they depend on kidneys for their elimination. So if you have patients with a chronic kidney disorder, end stage renal failure, and they need anticoagulant support, parenteral anticoagulant support, then unfractionated heparin is much preferred than the other two because it doesn't depend on the kidney, so its elimination is not affected because of their primary disease state. It's possible that sometimes you might have administered larger doses and the patients would have bleeding. In such cases, you may have to consider administering an antidote to counteract the bleeding. We'll be seeing it in a while. If a patient has bleeding episode following unfractionated heparin, we have an antidote that can completely neutralize this bleeding effect of unfractionated. And we have none for Fondaparinux, although recently they have shown there is a possible antidote for Fondaparinux. And for LMWH, the same antidote that we are using it for unfractionated can partially counteract the bleeding for LMWH. So these are all some important differences. Certainly there will be questions in exam related to this, and more importantly, it makes your understanding of choosing which parenteral anticoagulant based on the situation of the patient more justified. So please focus on this and imbibe these important differences. This is just to make you understand how the real preparations of these heparin anticoagulants look like. So this is how the vial of an unfractionated heparin will be. It has a lyophilized powder, or it may be, sometimes it could have a solution, and you can give either subcutaneously or intravenously, depending on whether you want to give it as a prophylaxis or for treatment. The low molecular weight heparin, they are called by different names: enoxaparin, ardiparin, nadoparin, tinzaparin. So it would be difficult if you want to remember all the names, but there is one common suffix. Anything that ends with parin, except for heparin, right? Except for this, if you see any drug that ends with parin, you could consider it as one of the low molecular weight heparin. So just an easy way to remember this. And it's usually you observe it in the pre-filled syringes because they are mainly given subcutaneously and as good as giving them in intravenously. Nowadays it's mainly subcutaneous that is preferred. Similarly, Fondaparinux also preferred subcutaneously. Both these have advantage. We just saw it. The subcutaneous absorption is almost close to 100%, right? So they are as good as giving IV. How do we monitor? Because just now I told you, because heparin has a considerable affinity to the plasma proteins, it becomes difficult for us to find out how much therapeutic effect it is exerting in that particular patient. So we need to monitor its anticoagulant effect, which is done by a lab testing called activated partial thromboplastin time. I'm sure you all know this method, which is from physiology, right? I'm not going into the details. So this APTT is the lab test that is used for monitoring heparin's activity, and for you to say that the heparin's dose is adequate in that patient, the APTT has to be prolonged by at least 2 to 3 times the normal. Only then the dose is considered adequate. If it is less than 2, you may have to consider increasing the dose. If it is more than 3, you may have to consider reducing the dose of heparin. What are the common adverse effects observed with heparin administration? Of course, the first and the foremost is the risk of bleeding. And often you need to ask the patient, is there any change in the urine color? Many a times hematuria is the first sign of over anticoagulation in patients receiving heparin. So if there is bleeding, we have an antidote which is called protamine sulfate. So this protamine is anionic. Heparin is cationic. So it binds to the heparin, neutralizes it, and reduces the heparin's anticoagulant effect. You need to also know the dose of protamine that you need to give for reversing the anticoagulant effect of heparin. For every 100 units of heparin that you have administered, you need to give 1 milligrams of protamine sulfate. For example, if you have administered 3000 units of heparin in a patient and the patient bleeds, then you need to give 30 milligrams of protamine to reverse this anticoagulant effect. The second important adverse effect that you need to also keep in mind is some patients, after being administered heparin, they may show a fall in the platelet count. Heparin induced thrombocytopenia, shortly we call it HIT. Heparin induced thrombocytopenia, right? There are two types of HIT. Type 1 is self-limiting, not serious. It is a transient drop in the platelet count. The exact mechanism is unknown, but it is not serious and the patient's platelet count will come back to normal within few days. On the other hand, type 2 is very serious. It is a life-threatening fall in the platelet count, and the mechanism has been completely elucidated for HIT type 2, which is like this. Assume these are the heparin molecules that you have administered in a patient, and assume these square boxes. These are the platelet factor 4 molecules. So this is again a physiological circulating molecule, and it is freely circulating in the blood. When you give heparin, we expect the heparin to bind to AT3, antithrombin 3, to show its therapeutic effect. But in some patients, heparin will bind to platelet factor 4 and this heparin platelet factor 4 complex. When heparin is circulating separately, there is no problem because heparin is there in our own body, so our immune system will not consider it as a foreign molecule. Similarly, when platelet factor 4 is circulating alone, there is no problem because it is a physiological molecule, so our immune system will not consider it as foreign. But when a complex forms between heparin and platelet factor 4, this complex is something new. It doesn't exist in our body. So this will be recognized as an antigen by the immune system. So the immune system will produce antibodies and you have formation of heparin, platelet factor 4 and the antibody complex. This complex can do one of the two things in an individual. It can bind to the platelet surface and activate the platelets. And you must be aware that platelets have lot of granules which are rich in substances called adenosine diphosphate, serotonin. So all these are called platelet activators. So once the platelets are activated, they are released into circulation and they cause platelets to aggregate. So platelets will aggregate and the circulating platelet count will fall down. So this can happen. Or the platelets, this antigen antibody complex can bind to the platelets and can destroy the platelets. So the platelet count again will fall down. So either way, either because of aggregation or because of destruction, there is going to be fall in the platelet count, which is referred to as thrombocytopenia. So that's why it is heparin induced thrombocytopenia due to the complex with platelet factor 4. This heparin induced thrombocytopenia is more common with the unfractionated and it's comparatively less with LMWH and fondaparinux. Nevertheless, if you have a patient whose previous history indicates that the patient has developed heparin induced thrombocytopenia type 2, then the patient should not be given even the low molecular weight heparin because it's something serious, life threatening, so better to avoid. Before choosing to give heparin, there are few contraindications that you need to rule out in the patient. Only if none of these exist in that patient, you can administer heparin. So if a patient has any active bleeding right now or is a known case of bleeding disorder, please don't choose heparin. Similarly, if the patient has some serious liver disease, thrombocytopenia, or has a BP in malignant, we have seen hypertensive crisis, right? It is also called malignant, or previously has developed HIT or hypersensitivity. So these are all some of the contraindications, important ones that should not be administered heparin. We also have few patients who, even after receiving such high doses, 35,000 to 50,000. Even after going to such high doses of heparin, they fail to show adequate therapeutic effect. APTT will not increase beyond 1.5 times despite receiving so much higher heparin dose. These patients are referred to as heparin resistant. It's because heparin, being a charged molecule, right? It's a highly charged molecule. It can bind to many proteins, and we have few proteins called vitronectin and the platelet factor 4, which we just saw, and binding to these proteins and not binding to AT3, right, or binding to these proteins will reduce their fraction that binds to AT3, and so they will not exert the adequate anticoagulant effect. It's mainly again observed with unfractionated heparin, and both LMWH and Fondaparin-X, they bind considerably less to other proteins, and so they don't interfere with they don't have this problem of resistance. So if a patient with such high dose of unfractionated is unable to achieve adequate anticoagulation, it's better to prefer one of these LMWH or Fondaparin-X. The last slide for heparin. When do I give heparin? What are the indications? This is an interesting picture. If you remember this picture, you will be able to identify the indications. I'll give you a few seconds, just go through this picture, and I'm sure all of you will pick it up. I'll just wait for a few seconds. Alright, so I'm sure you must have got it. So this picture refers to heart acute. So acute coronary syndrome. We'll be seeing it in a while. Medical term for patients who have angina, who have myocardial infarction. So especially patients with myocardial infarction, we prefer parenteral anticoagulant first. Atrial fibrillation in patients with prosthetic heart valves with thrombi in the left atrium. Pregnant women, normally they don't require, but if you have a pregnant with identified thromboembolic disorder, DVT, or antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, or a rheumatic heart disease patient with left atrial enlargement, with atrial fibrillation, then again heparin is preferred. And in the heparin, both unfractionated, low molecular weight are equally safe in pregnancy. Nowadays LMWH is much preferred compared to unfractionated. The last indication related to the present case, DVT. You can see the legs, right? So legs are wound. So DVT, holding the lungs, pulmonary embolism. So these are all the indications for heparin. So with this, we complete the first class of anticoagulants, and these are all the important points that you need to be confident of answering, so that you have got the essentials of therapeutics of parenteral anticoagulants. Just read the questions and try to answer it. If you are confident, you nailed it. So moving to the second class of anticoagulants, which is orally administered, the mainly most commonly used is warfarin. Proteins, we all know, they are synthesized from the rough endoplasmic reticulum. almost all the proteins, after they are released from the endoplasmic reticulum, they are active. They can do the job which is assigned to them. No problem. But for some proteins, after they are synthesized from rough endoplasmic reticulum, they are still inactive. And they need to undergo one of post-translational modification. Like they need to have an additional phosphate group or a carbohydrate group or a ubiquitin, right? Or a carboxyl group. So they need one such groups to attach to them, and only then the protein becomes active. This is called post-translational modification. Biochemists must have taught you. The clotting factors, amongst the 13 clotting factors, factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 need one such post-translational modification, which is carboxylation. Only when carboxyl residue is attached to these clotting factors, they become active and they can get involved in the coagulation cascade. You have seen factor 2 is the pre-final step, thrombin. Factor 7 is the tissue factor, extrinsic. Factor 10, common factor. Factor 9, intrinsic. So, for these clotting factors to be active, you need the carboxyl group to attach, and for this to happen, we need vitamin K. So vitamin K is needed at adequate quantities to ensure this post-translational modification occurs in the 2, 7, 9 and 10 factors, and that becomes active to get involved in the coagulation cascade. But vitamin K exists in inactive form in our body. Epoxide is its inactive form, and it has to be converted to the active form, and only this active form can allow this factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 to undergo carboxylation. And this activation of vitamin K happens by an enzyme called vitamin K reductase, vitamin K epoxide reductase. So now when you give warfarin to a patient, what happens? The warfarin goes to the liver, where this activation of vitamin K and synthesis of clotting factors is occurring, goes to the liver, binds to the vitamin K epoxide reductase and inhibit that enzyme. So if this enzyme is inhibited, you don't have vitamin K. If vitamin K is not there, 2, 7, 9, 10 are not activated. If they are not activated, you disrupt the coagulation cascade. And that's how warfarin acts as anticoagulant. But the drawback of warfarin is that, not a significant, we can overcome this drawback, but still it's a drawback of warfarin, is that if you compare with heparin, how does heparin act? Heparin binds to AT3 in the circulation and inhibits factor 2 and factor 10. So when you give heparin, its effect is immediate because it just binds to the circulating AT3 and stimulates, accelerates it, and that it produces its anticoagulant effect immediately. On the other hand, how does warfarin act? Warfarin is given orally, it gets absorbed from the GIT, goes to the liver, inhibits vitamin K epoxide reductase, inhibits synthesis, right? It inhibits the synthesis of 2, 7, 9 and 10. Let's assume Now the time is here around 10 o'clock. Okay. So let's assume I am taking warfarin now, 10 o'clock. Now the warfarin gets absorbed from my GIT. It will go to my liver now and it will inhibit the synthesis of 2, 7, 9 and 10 only from now onwards, only from 10 o'clock onwards. But my liver would have already synthesized these clotting factors in the morning, last night, yesterday afternoon, yesterday morning, right? And whatever clotting factors which have been already synthesized will not be affected by warfarin. And of these 4 clotting factors, 2, 7, 9 and 10, the factor 2, thrombin, it has a half-life of nearly 2.5 days. So for already synthesized factor 2 to disappear from the systemic circulation, it nearly takes 3 to 5 days. And that is why if I start taking warfarin from 10 o'clock now, today, which is I think 22nd of April, it will minimum take 5 days. So 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th. Only on 26th of April, if you see in my circulation, I will not have any of the factor 2, 7, 9 and 10. And only from that day onwards, warfarin is considered to have started its therapeutic effect. So this is a drawback. Because heparin inhibits circulating clotting factors, its effect is instantaneous. But warfarin will take a minimum 5 days, and that is why whenever you choose to consider shifting a patient from parenteral to oral anticoagulant, always there has to be a bridge where the patient receives both heparin and warfarin for 5 days, and then you could stop heparin and the patient can continue only on warfarin. So that's why you would see this happening even in the present problem, where the patient was initiated both heparin and warfarin together. The justification, the therapeutic rationale is in the mechanism. So never ever warfarin should be, or a patient who is receiving heparin should be transferred to warfarin therapy without bridging. Keep this point in mind. Warfarin is 100% bioavailable. Almost all of it that you administer it in the GI tract will get absorbed. And warfarin has 2 isomers, enantiomers, R and S warfarin. S warfarin is almost 3 times more potent than R, which means it has the major chunk of inhibiting vitamin K epoxide reductase and producing the therapeutic effect compared to the R. At the same time, the S warfarin is metabolized by a liver enzyme called cytochrome P450-2C9. We have a term called pharmacogenetics. I'm not sure whether you have encountered this terminology before in Unit 1. When we are referring to the effect of any drug, they are influenced by many variables. Let's say we have 2 patients and they are receiving warfarin at the same dose, and you are measuring what is the anticoagulant effect of the warfarin which they are receiving, you would see that their response differs significantly. One may exert great activity, one might have poor activity, therapeutic effect of warfarin. Many factors are responsible for this difference in warfarin's therapeutic effect between the individuals. One such factor is the ability of the CYP2C9 to metabolize warfarin. So the CYP2C9 in some individuals are very fast and in some individuals are slow. We have different varieties. We call them as polymorphisms. You don't have to go much in details. Only thing that you need to keep in mind is the CYP2C9 activity is different between the individuals that can considerably influence the warfarin's therapeutic effect. So here comes the role of genetics as a variable determining the response of a drug. So this is referred to as pharmacogenetics, study of genetic factors as influencing variables for therapeutic response of a drug. Very important for warfarin. And an additional important point for you as a general practitioner is, if you have a patient on warfarin, you need to keep in mind that there are some drugs which inhibit the CYP2C9. There are some drugs which induce the CYP2C9. This list is not exhaustive. It doesn't have the list of all the inhibitors and inducers, only the very commonly used inducers it has. But when you encounter a patient receiving warfarin, you should be more careful while prescribing any additional drug. You need to cross check whether it is an enzyme inhibitor or inducer with respect to CYP2C9, and then accordingly adjust the dose of the drug you are going to prescribe, as well as recommend the dose of warfarin that the patient is taking to be adjusted. So this is important point with regard to your practice. Don't just add a drug just because the patient has a fever, analgesic, right? Be careful when you have a patient on warfarin. Many antibiotics do influence warfarin's therapeutic effect. So you have to be very, very careful in your clinical practice. Warfarin is usually administered bedtime. Why? Because it's believed and has been shown that hepatic function is maximum at night time. We'll also be seeing this in the last session in the unit 3, which is related to cholesterol synthesis, which also happens in liver. So the clotting factor synthesis which occurs in the liver is believed to happen more at night time. Although there are contradictory statements, generally it is the belief that hepatic function is maximum at night, and so warfarin is usually administered at night time. And because patients are very sensitive even to small changes in the dose, you would see each of the dose has a different color coding, which is hardly the case. You won't see such type of precaution advised and taken care by the pharmaceutical company with many other drugs. Here there is a color coding for warfarin tablets, so the patient can be more cautious. Okay, if he is taking brown, it refers to the low dosage, so there is a reduced chances of medication errors, right, which is serious in warfarin. As like activated partial thromboplastin time for heparin, to know whether the dose of warfarin is appropriate in that patient, we use a laboratory measure called prothrombin time, PT. As like APTT, for adequate anticoagulation, the PT has to be maintained between 2 and 3. If you have patients whose valves have been replaced, who has undergone valve replacement surgeries, then their PT will be considered to be adequate if it is between 2.5 to 3.5. So now you may not find it difficult, but having gone through all the pharmacology resource sessions, right, and not only pharmacology, if you have physiology, biochem, having at the end of this unit, then you'll be confused. Is APTT for heparin or is PT for heparin? So there is a simple mnemonic that you could keep in mind that will help you to remember this. Add the number of alphabets that you have in heparin and just leave that A, okay? Add PTT, it will give you 10 letters. Similarly, add the number of alphabets in warfarin and PT, it will give you 10 letters. So if you are going to interchange it, it won't give you 10 letters. So with this mnemonic, you could easily remember that it's APTT for heparin and it is PT, prothrombin time, for warfarin. Many a times you go wrong on this. So that's why this mnemonic can help you in remembering this. As like heparin, the most common important adverse effect with warfarin is again bleeding. This bleeding is more common when PT INR is maybe above 4, 4.5, 5, 6. If it is more than 8, definitely the patient is going to present with some bleeding episode. If you have bleeding in a patient receiving warfarin, fresh frozen plasma is the treatment of choice. This has to be immediately given, and you can also choose to give factor 9 concentrate and they can immediately stop the bleeding. Along with it, you can give vitamin K1 injection as the antidote. If you have patients whose PT is more than 4, they are likely to land up in a bleeding episode, and we usually consider stopping warfarin for a day or 2 and recheck INR, and when it comes back within the therapeutic range, we restart warfarin. Warfarin inhibits mainly the clotting factors 2, 7, 9 and 10 by inhibiting their carboxylation. The same carboxylation step is important for certain naturally circulating anticoagulants called protein C and protein S. So these are naturally occurring anticoagulants, and for them to exert their anticoagulant activity, they need to undergo the same carboxylation process. But when you give warfarin, warfarin inhibits this. So warfarin reduces the naturally occurring anticoagulant, so it shifts the balance towards prothrombotic state in some patients. So in some patients, the blood vessels which are supplying such fatty tissue beneath the skin, they can be blocked by thrombus, and that leads to reduced blood supply, necrosis. So this happens usually in the first week of therapy, right? Another adverse effect that can be observed with warfarin, particularly in middle to old aged individuals, is purple toe syndrome. Blood vessels, I have spoken to you about this in one of the previous, yes, it was in the last session in antihypertensives, where we had a patient who has, if the patients have atherosclerosis in their peripheral vessels and they have intermittent claudication, right, peripheral vascular disease, we don't choose beta blockers, but we choose alpha blockers, right? So peripheral blood vessels in some patients may have atherosclerosis, and when such patients receive warfarin, it can induce micro bleeds into this atherosclerotic plaque, and this plaque can embolize and it can go and block the small blood vessels supplying the tip of the toes, and that can result in gangrene if not addressed immediately. So this is again a possible adverse effect with warfarin. And another important concern with warfarin is administering it to your pregnant. Warfarin has been shown to cross the placenta very well and inhibits protein C and protein S, which in the developing fetus is important for bone formation from the cartilage. So when warfarin is administered to a pregnant, particularly in the first trimester, it can cause various congenital defects. You don't have to know the specific features, but it can result in a spectrum of bone abnormalities, which is referred to as coumarin embryopathy, otherwise Conradi syndrome. So these are the drawbacks of giving warfarin, particularly in the first trimester. Second trimester, no problem. So that is why warfarin has to be avoided in the first trimester of pregnancy. What are the indications for warfarin? Don't have to break the head much. It goes similar to heparin. So wherever you give heparin, you are going to bridge it with warfarin, and the only difference is how long should you continue on warfarin. And at your level, I don't think so it's important, because this decision is going to be taken by the specialist who is treating the appropriate disorder. Otherwise, the indications for warfarin will be the same: acute coronary syndrome, atrial fibrillation, rheumatic heart disease patients, pulmonary embolism, DVT long-standing. So these are going to be the indications where you bridge from heparin to warfarin. You shift from heparin to warfarin. So to compare heparin and warfarin, the most commonly administered parenteral and the oral, the key differences are like this. When you give heparin, its effect is immediate because it neutralizes the circulating clotting factors. When you give warfarin, it's delayed because it is inhibiting the synthesis. So already synthesized factors will take some time to get degraded. Till then, you won't appreciate the therapeutic effect of warfarin. Heparin inhibits factor 10 and 2, while warfarin inhibits 2, 7, 9 and 10. This is another important point where most of you go wrong. So you could keep in this way: 2, 7, and 2 plus 7 is going to be 9, right? And only 10. So these are the 4 common factors that are inhibited by warfarin. If a patient bleeds following heparin, protamine is the antidote, and for warfarin, vitamin K. Monitoring for heparin is activated partial thromboplastin time. For warfarin, it is prothrombin time. Right? So these are all some of the key differences. And recently, we have another category of anticoagulants called directly acting anticoagulants. If you remember, heparin acts by stimulating AT3, which binds and inactivates factor 10 and factor 2. So heparin is an indirect anticoagulant. It doesn't have any direct connection to the clotting factors and inhibits it. Similarly, warfarin. What warfarin does it go and bind to any clotting factors? No. It inhibits vitamin K production, and that vitamin K synthesis inhibits factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 carboxylation. So again, warfarin is an indirect anticoagulant. But recently we have certain drugs which can directly bind to factor 10. So they are factor 10A inhibitor, and there are some which can bind to factor 2 directly, and they are called direct factor 2A inhibitor or direct thrombin inhibitor. So these are the 2 categories. Direct thrombin inhibitor, we have dabigatran, direct thrombin inhibitor. Dabigatran, it inhibits factor 2, and these are the three agents which inhibit factor 10. You can easily remember. If you see their name, they contain the suffix XA, which looks like a 10A. So whenever you see a drug ending with XA, it actually means, they are direct factor 10A inhibitor. Rivaroxaban, apixaban, edoxaban. So these are the direct factor 10A inhibitors. Warfarin, which is the commonly used oral anticoagulant, one of the drawback is it has got a lot of drug interactions, which is considerably less with these direct anticoagulants. And the monitoring that we do for warfarin, which is PT-INR, no need for monitoring if the patients are in any such direct anticoagulants. But the only thing is they have recently come up, so they are very expensive. It will take a while for us to replace warfarin, which can take several decades. So until now, you need to be familiar in and out about warfarin, and just be aware that we have some direct acting anticoagulants. That's all. So these are all the answers for the MCQs in the last session. And there was one MCQ in the rheumatic heart disease problem, MCQ number 3, which talks about a patient with rheumatic heart disease who is undergoing a major extraction of the teeth, and she is allergic to penicillin. So what is the prophylaxis that you would give to avoid infective endocarditis? And there was an error in the answer. It was given A, when in fact the right answer is answer B. So it has to be clindamycin, because the patient is allergic to penicillin. She can't be administered ampicillin. So just make this change. Otherwise, as usual, I have some practice MCQs for this session. So please go through it, and if you have any clarifications, contradictions, always feel free to discuss with me. Thank you, and take care.